focus group that we started 3 years ago. The work started 4 years ago. The work started many, many decades ago. But at NWSA, we became an official interest group in 2015, and the group is called Feminists for Justice in Palestine. We have a meeting immediately after this session to talk about next year and other projects that are ongoing. We are going to ask each member of this roundtable to introduce herself in relation to the topic briefly, and then we will proceed with longer but short, longish short presentations on the relationship between justice and transnational feminist praxis, and then we'll open it up to conversation. So I'll go. Do you wanna start, Yen? And then
Do you want to start? No, you don't have to.
okay. You want
not necessary.
to start the talk?
No, actually, we'll have Elora start.
Okay.
Yeah,
Makes more sense.
Well, thank you. My name is Elora Chowdhury, and I'm a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and it's a real honor to be on this panel. I have to say my relationship to this work around the Palestinian struggle is rather circuitous. I have not written about this question, or I have not been on a solidarity trip. I know some of us on this panel have, but my personal connection to this work really goes back to my childhood. So I was born in Bangladesh. I grew up there, and there has, in the early 70s and 80s, when I was growing up, there was actually a very strong presence of activist work at the national level around the question of Palestine. And I think the reason for that was there was always a connection to this question of occupation and colonization and the national liberation struggle of Bangladesh and Palestine. So as some of you will know, that Bangladesh became an independent country after a long civil war with West Pakistan, and the occupation that lasted since 1947, the partition of the Indian subcontinent, had many similar elements to the struggle in Palestine, Israel. So, and in the 70s and 80s, actually, and even now, we have an embassy, a Palestinian embassy in Dhaka, and there were regular cultural events that were held. I remember that on the 25th anniversary of Bangladesh independence, world leaders like Yasser Arafat and Nelson Mandela were invited, and along with the then president of Bangladesh, there was a sort of a global conversation about revolution and about struggle and the connection among some of these struggles unfolding around the world, and solidarity at that level. And I think I was very influenced by that consciousness, and bring that consciousness to my own teaching and research. And at UMass Boston, I direct a program in human rights, which is very closely connected to our campus faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine group. And we have been working together for many years now in terms of developing pedagogy, outreach, organizing around a solidarity with this sort of transnational historical lens. So I think that's how I come into this work.
Good morning. Apologies for being late. I want to just give a little bit. I don't know how many of you have been there in 2014 in Puerto Rico. Oh. Okay. 2015. Okay. How many people know? I just don't want to spend too much time doing history if people know it. So, okay. So then let me just give very brief, and then I can talk why I'm here. But this is, we actually, well, I'll begin maybe with my relationship with NWSA, because some of us have been much longer in NWSA than me. Simona was wearing a tag that says 10 years. But my relationship began actually in 2012. We had a panel at the National Women's Studies Association in San Francisco, and it was about the whole question of decolonization, and it was, we co-organized it with Rupal Oza, Humadar, from Kashmir, the Chandra Mohanty, Sunera Thubani, and we actually were comparing the relationship with what's going on with Palestine and what's going on with South Asia. And Kashmir is today, is Bangladesh. In the 70s, today we're talking about Kashmir. And we organized that panel, and then the next year I participated in a presidential plenary with Elora. That was because of the Trisha Chen, Trisha Ren, who was the president at the time, invited us. In 2014, that was the most, I believe that was really the turning point. In 2014, it was the conference in Puerto Rico, and it was also 2-3 months after the Israeli invasion attack, biggest massacre in Gaza. Well, I don't know which one is the biggest. Even the classification becomes a question here. And there were over 2,500 members in Puerto Rico. And this is maybe part of the oral history stuff for the later panel, but suffice it to say, many of us here actually came together and we organized a group, and it was really at the prodding of Petchesky, who's not here today because she has to take care of a family member, and other people, and Simona, myself, then Penny, you joined Sherry Gorelick, who is not here now, but she's going to be throughout the day, Rupal, many Sonera, many people who were in Puerto Rico. We basically put together a petition, and we told the council we wanted to have something on Palestine. And the council was okay with it. I mean, there was not yet any kind of disagreements, but we put out the petition, and within 24 hours, we had 800 members sign up. 800 members signed up saying that we really have to have a position on Palestine, and specifically supporting Palestinian liberation, supporting BDS, blockade divestment and sanctions, and also asserting that we believe that Palestine is a feminist issue according to our definition of what feminism is. We did not say every single feminism is a feminism that relates to Palestine. And we presented it, and there was a very big, first of all, Bell Hooks was the keynote speaker, and when we asked her, what do you think about Palestine, she said 100%, and it was like 2,500 people in the room. It was a very different space than the history of NWSA that has historically invisibilized Palestine, and I don't think it was unintentionally invisibilizing Palestine. And I think later on we can talk about the history of Zionism, women's studies, women's movement, and so on. And it's a very long discussion. And the next day, Chandra Mohanty had organized a keynote panel, and it was also attended by 2,500 people. And Chandra has been on a delegation 2011 that I organized and co-led to Palestine, including Angela Davis, Wazia Tawan, Primila Nadansan, who's the president, Barbara Ransby, the outgoing president, and many others. There was 11 of us. And so Chandra organized the panel, and then we submitted the petition, and we were told that the council could not adopt it because they needed a month about bylaws and technical issues, bureaucratic issues, and so on. However, this was not, sometimes technicalities are used and bureaucracy is used to subvert things. I mean, we know that. We are in departments We know how it is that if you don't want anything to happen, you come up with all sorts of technical reasons, and you create new technical reasons and new bureaucratic ways in order to stop things. But here, it was not actually, there were the bylaws, there was support overall from the body. And Tricia Lynn, who was the president at the time, and we submitted it to her, she said, the body has spoken. I think she said the membership has spoken. So then it became a question of technicalities now. Now it's a different kind of technicalities to get the proposal signed. And we worked very hard, and you know, Simona and I and many others, Penny and also the other comrade sisters that I've mentioned, worked very hard, and we basically submitted a proposal and to the meeting in Milwaukee in 2015. And in the Milwaukee meeting, it was, we just discussed it, it was the first time that NWSA, and this is something interesting to know for the people who want to do oral histories, why is it that NWSA changed the rules at that time to make the vote electronic? So there were two major proposals at that time, ours, and there was a proposal for the adjunct faculty to support people who are contingent faculty, and we supported each other. There was another one on transnational feminism, but there was no contestation around that. It was okay. But these two there were issues around that, and we supported each other. We believe that it's all part of the indivisibility of justice. And then we went, but then NWSA put the vote over the Thanksgiving break. And so when the vote came out, it was over 66%. It was the week, the day after Thanksgiving, which was a holiday. And I'm actually, by saying Thanksgiving, I mean Thanksgiving. Okay? I don't mean it as Thanksgiving. Okay? And it was right after the holiday. And so it was not really noted as widely as it could have noted. And I think this is something, it's interesting. Because, and now I'm going to just like say a little bit of why I think the vote happened and what the challenges continue to face us. So the vote, I believe the vote happened because of what I call the browning of NWSA. The browning NWSA, and I'm not talking about identity politics. I'm not talking about people who become leaders because of the color of their skin. I'm talking about the kind of politics, the radical politics that has been taking over for a very long time within NWSA that brought around a different kind of leadership and a different kind of understanding what women's studies, what women gender and feminist studies is, where is the place of queer studies, how do we think about the questions of justice. I mean, people always say all issues are women's issues. And sometimes they say except, or they imply that the except is implied. So except Palestine, there is the implication of that. Except people will talk about all sorts of inequalities, but then when it comes to who is going to be at the helm of implementing inequalities, you see a different kind of, so there isn't kind of like a fit between the content and the form, if you want to talk Marxist analysis, right? So there was a contradiction in that sense. But over the years there has been changes, and I'm really convinced, and you can challenge me on that. I'm really convinced, had it not been for that wave of leadership that was realized at one point with the leadership of Beverly Guy-Sheftall at Spelman College, who became president, followed by Tricia Lynn. And then I'm going to leave the book out there, the verdict out there, what happened the next 2 years afterwards. But I think the tide has moved to get to the point where Barbara Ransby is president today, and we have the various panels and so on, and we have very big presence of Palestine. Maybe a little bit too big in my view, but we can discuss that. Okay, sometimes we get overexcited and we overdo it, but I don't think we should do more for next year. We should just like think about how to consolidate. But I believe that was one of the main reasons why it was possible for us. There was something different about the organization. Now I'm applying social movement analysis. The second thing is that we had met in Puerto Rico in 2014, and the Puerto Rican women got up in front of the stage, carried the Palestinian flag, and said, we support Palestine. And we were in a colonized space. We were in a settler colony. We were in a place where the people who were actually resisting themselves have also led credence. The participation of the body, of course, we know a lot of people go to conferences in nice places because sometimes they want to take a vacation afterwards. Okay, fair. We work very hard as people in the academy and so on. It's all right to do that, but there was also a very, very big presence. There was a big presence from the Caribbean. There was a very big presence from the leadership, not only from the elected leadership, but also from the people who spoke in the various plenaries. So there was this kind of, and I think most importantly, the context, what was going on in Gaza, the Israeli bombing of Gaza, and the Palestinian resistance. Because I don't believe people only act when they see grave injustices. I mean, we know 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. The world did not really act. Now the world is remembering, after too little too late. But they didn't act at the time. So tragedies in themselves. But some people responded to Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but the rest, there wasn't really. European countries and the US and so on closed their doors. The same thing happened with apartheid South Africa for a very long time. There have been people who have been oppressed until people started holding these big uprisings and resisting Sharpeville and Soweto and so on. That's when the rest of the world starts responding. The same thing with Vietnam, same thing with Algeria, the same thing with the whole. I think this is the context really has to do something with it, and then the response happens. So all of these conditions coalesce together to make it possible to make the proposal and to actually start visibilizing Palestine in the ranks of women's studies and the National Women's Studies Association. That brings us here. So we had the vote in 2015. In 2016, 2017, we did not have really much presence. We tried, we proposed, and so on. This one, and it's not for the lack of trying. Those of us who are actually leading this effort are quite tenacious and quite persistent and don't take no for an answer. We all worked very hard and so on. But I think it was, and I think the coalition, the kind of coalition we put together, and we did not even try to put together the coalition. The coalition came together of the various sister comrades, academics who actually made it happen. I mean, everybody, we came around, and I think, and I'm not going to speak because I know you want to talk about it. I don't know if you want to do that, but I think the coalition, okay, I'm not going to speak for you, but the coalition came together from people from all around, all backgrounds, came together on the questions of not only justice for in Palestine, but justice for in Palestine as part of the indivisibility of justice. So this is where I'm going to stop because I took enough time. I can talk later about my own research. I don't know.
I'll go last. You want me to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Penny Rosenwasser. I'm on staff at the Middle East Children's Alliance, and in the early 90s, starting with 1991, I organized and led 4 women's peace delegations to Palestine and Israel. And also around that time, I did a bunch of interviews for a radio station, KPFA, interviewing Palestinian, mostly women, but men as well, and Israeli Jewish peace activists. And I published my first book, which was Voices from a Promised Land, Palestinian and Israeli Peace Activists Speak Their Hearts. I also I was a founding board member of Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm still active with JVP. And of course, our mission is really trying to influence US policy to conform with international law, which if we did, there would be justice for Palestine. I also, currently I teach a class at City College of San Francisco on anti-Arabism and anti-Semitism, and I co-teach it with a Palestinian colleague. And I guess the only other important thing to say at this point is as a white Ashkenazi Jew, a feminist, queer, lesbian, you know, it's just really important to me to have justice, equality, dignity for all peoples, including all the peoples of Palestine, the peoples of Israel. And so there's a tradition in Jewishness called Tikkun Olam, which is really the repair, the healing of the world. So to me, it's just that's in part of my ethical tradition and spiritual tradition to do everything I can to fight for justice for Palestine. And so it's a real honor for me to be here with these esteemed scholars and activists. So I'll say more later. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Diana Block. I have a cough, so I hope if I'm overcome by coughing, it's not because of the topic at all. It's just that I am struggling with this. Well, my solidarity work with Palestine really dates back to the 70s. And my work around women and international women's solidarity also dates back to the 70s when I did a lot of work around in solidarity with women in Vietnam and then women in Zimbabwe and others. But my more recent intersection has to do with a trip, a delegation I was on with that Rabab led in 2016 to Palestine. I have been involved with anti-imprisonment work and specifically around women and prisons since 1995. I was a founding member of the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. And so in going to Palestine, myself and my partner, Claude, we were working with Rabab to do a delegation focused on imprisonment in Palestine. And that was an incredible trip. We can talk more about what that meant, but coming off of that, I have been committed to really trying to develop the analysis and the practice of figuring out the intersections between the carceral strategy in Palestine and in the United States, which in fact are very, very closely linked. And in the course of that work, since my work around prisons is mainly centered on women and transgender nonconforming people, trying to figure out how to make those connections, specifically in terms of the women's prisons and women's imprisonment, has been a focus. And after the delegation, we produced a pamphlet that was about, well, yeah, we don't have enough for people, they're out of print, but it's called For the Love of Palestine, Stories of Women, Imprisonment, and Resistance. So we produced this pamphlet. We have done a lot of other things. We just recently, last week, did a great panel in San Francisco with Rabab and several other members, people representing anti-imprisonment, abolitionist practice. And so I really, my angle on this, which I really encourage people to investigate and become involved in, is really understanding the links, because the repression and the carceral systems are very key to the colonial project. And therefore, I think it's a very important thing to understand those resistances and how we can be in solidarity from the United States.
Just talk about that panel too. Yeah. So I don't know if people have the sheet of information of our all the section panels as well as sessions. We've made it. We have some flyers going around. I know tomorrow there is a panel that Diana and Ali Paradise are doing on the question of prisons. Today there is after this panel there is the section meeting, then there is a panel on the oral history. So throughout you can actually expand on all these topics if there is much.
If you misplace that piece of paper that's passing around, you could search your app. It's searchable. You can't do it with the physical program, but on the app you could just put Palestine as a keyword, and then all the sessions will come up. Okay, so it's great to be on a session that celebrates the connection between scholarship and activism before we even talk about Palestine, because sometimes we take it for granted, but since we're looking for ways to make explicit how this theorizing about Palestine in the context of feminist engagement with praxis is relevant beyond those of us who already do it. It's important to note that there are very few spaces where this relationship is foregrounded and celebrated and sometimes taken for granted in how we do what we do, and the fact that all of us are also involved in ongoing struggles outside of our classrooms, in our communities, as well as transnationally with people in Palestine. And I think this is it's very important to make explicit. My connection as an activist started in the early 80s in Israel, and as I was reflecting on it in preparation for this panel, and we've done similar panels in the past, it became clear to me that that actually Palestine was the foundation of my budding feminism. Even though I kind of became aware of injustices that were gender-based and the injustices in Palestine that I was implicated in, my understanding of the structural roots of intersectionality and how I was situated in relation to them happened somewhat intuitively, but it was me being implicated as someone who was part of a settler colonial context that constantly was there as the other side of what was easier to identify with, which was my oppression, discrimination as a woman. And I say it because I think this is really important to how we theorize about transnational feminist praxis or critical intersectionality with Palestine at the center. Because even for people who are not Jewish and are not as intimately implicated in the oppression and genocide in Palestine as I am, everyone who carries a US passport is. And if for people who are white and benefit from white skin privilege in any spaces dealing with whiteness and the settler colonialism of the US is difficult, connecting to it vis-a-vis Palestine may be a shortcut. So what I'm suggesting here is that in looking back at my own experience, that my coming of age as a feminist at the time of my growing awareness to the injustices in Palestine were intertwined, but that relationship and the struggle that I was involved with that included Palestinians who educated me about stuff that was not in textbooks. It was that kind of critical, and I'm using the word dialogue in quotations because I'm going to problematize it in a second, but it was really the privilege to work with people who, as part of their struggle, understood that transforming the consciousness of the oppressor was an important part of the struggle, but also the how you do it was pivotal here. That they did, it was not based on that illusion of symmetry, and that was precisely what helped me move towards action, and why dialogue became an insufficient framework for me to engage around structured inequalities, systems of oppression in the classroom. So all this discussion about civility and what's controversial, when I arrived in the US, I already had that experience of why it doesn't work, so it didn't make sense to me. To my introduction to Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith talking back to mainstream white feminists, and I choose those because there were others. Their critique was based on a praxis of why dialogue is insufficient, of whether the failures, of whether the silences, including in feminist spaces, of why you cannot first coalesce around similarities and then deal with the difficult issues, why the conversations have to include those difficult issues that divide us, and why oppressions, that's not an Olympic of oppression, and no one has monopoly over which issues should not be discussed. And the oral history project, I think our sister Sherry Gorelick will talk more about the silences around Palestine at NWSA. I had attended my first conference in 1992 while I was finishing my doctoral dissertation, trying to argue that you have to theorize about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by listening to women activists in Israel-Palestine. So it was kind of, at that time, radical methodologically and theoretically. And I felt alienated in my male-dominated PhD program that was then in conflict resolution. But I came to NWSA looking for a community to talk about those issues, and it was extremely marginalized. So taking, kind of bell hooks is from margin to center. We worked kind of tenaciously and systematically to move from margin to center, but I totally agree here with Rabab that the margins at NWSA became the center.
Yep.
So we do owe a lot to us sisters who made it happen, but we were also part of that movement and part of the critique. So it wasn't that we waited and were like, okay, now it's easier for us. I think there was an understanding that to make sense of the world, we have to rethink how we do feminism and who is part of our movement and who is marginalized and which voices are foregrounded and which voices are marginalized. From my own understanding and how I engage with it in a feminist theory classroom, I teach a class on feminist theories in action right now. It's crucial to talk about, to mainstream Palestine. And I don't say they are very critical of gender mainstreaming, but as an activist, you sometimes take the strategy. I think mainstreaming Palestine is the antidote to the criminalization of Palestine solidarity. You take an issue that is first and foremost an issue about ongoing injustice, that we politicize, we the collective we on this panel, and made it a feminist issue, but outside of our circle is still criminalized. So the work has been, how do we reframe, theorize, develop literature, create spaces where we challenge that criminalization and actually mainstream it and say, it's actually not controversial when you look at what's happening on the ground, when you compare it to other struggles. It's a human rights issue, it's a basic injustice issue. This is how it connected to other structures of oppression, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia. This is how the violence inflicted on Palestinian bodies and the discourses used to narrate it are similar to gender-based violence in particular settings. And this work has been ongoing. What was critical, what remains critical to this work is decentering the conflict, is really shifting away from talking about Palestine within the framework of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that always creates a false symmetry and an expectation that when you talk about Palestine, you also talk about Israel. You also affirm the right of Israel to exist, that there are two voices, and placating to that aspect of criminalization of feminist and non-feminist, or work that's not explicitly feminist for justice in for Palestine, that always has one foot on the brake, so to speak, on the intellectual brake, fearing the accusation of anti-Semitism, and needing to draw those conclusions. So a lot of the work, it's slowed down because we anticipate those critiques. I have a privilege of because of the way I'm situated in relation to be able to ignore it more than some of my sisters who are not Jewish. But Rabab, the message that he passed to me, she and that's going to be the last point that I'll make for now, reminded me that in organizing at NWSA, I was pretty vocal and got into some conflicts with my sisters around the need to decenter Jewish voices as we pushed for BDS within NWSA. And I want to say something about it because I think it's extremely important. I think to do solidarity work must begin with the need of those most oppressed. In Palestine, it must start with Palestinians and other Arabs outside of Palestine. It has, because in talking about why as Jews we support Palestine, we engage in this conversation among Jews at NWSA or elsewhere with Jews that don't think so, and the work ends up being diverted to convincing other Jews that this is okay. It's the same, similar to, it's not similar, but it could be compared to anti-white supremacy work, and there have been some good discussions about whiteness at its NWSA. This is the work that Jews should do with Jews in the Jewish caucus outside of NWSA. The struggle of mainstreaming Palestine, of making it central to feminist, transnational feminist praxis, cannot be centered around Jewish voices. Jewish voices are part of it, but it has been an obstacle, and we learned to engage with Palestinians involved in the struggle in asking how can we be helpful to the struggle and doing work that is less at the center. I think I'm gonna stop here. So we have about half an hour. We can, if people have comments now, or we can take comments and make it more of a roundtable and engage on anything what brings you to this work, anything that you heard that made you think about your connection, or where do we go from here, or how do we deal with this in our classroom?
Do we want to take maybe 1 minute each
to respond? Yeah.
Reflect or not, or we can ask, get comments from the people and then come back.
Let's take a round of comments and then we can.
Can you say your name, please? And speak loud, we can't hear you.
Oh, my name is Janine.
Janine.
Jones. Thank you very much for all of your comments. I guess my question would be, it could be for all of you, but it would be for you, because at one point you were saying that, and I'm a militant here. So, you were saying that there's been now, or there's tending to be too much of a presence. And so I wanted to know why you thought that, especially in these moments where, when I speak with my Palestinian friends, they talk about not just Palestine, but here in the United States, how they are shut down. I have friends who've been shut out of jobs if they talk, if they say anything. They don't have those privileged voices they're allowed to talk. So I would think that whatever too large means, it would have to be in proportion to where women and other Palestinians cannot speak at all elsewhere. So that's what I was really wondering about. And I guess I was also wondering, when you talk about there being such a large presence, or going towards too much, I'm thinking about the panelists here, and I'm just wondering, like, I'm thinking of my friend sitting here and wondering, why isn't there someone like me, meaning her, up there talking? So those two things together. And, yeah.
Just can you explain the second point, me, not her?
Well, my friend is Palestinian American. And so I can imagine her sitting here, hearing things about a large presence of Palestinians now coming into, or this, and wondering why the panel itself doesn't represent what seems to be now this overwhelming presence of Palestinians.
Wait, aren't there more Palestinians on the panel?
Well, not why there isn't more, but again, in relation to what you're saying, and also, well, it could be that question, but also in relation to this idea that it's getting to be too large, the presence. How does that, in what sense? It's certainly not visible or audible. So, yes.
Other comments?
You're just, yeah. Oh, I mean, are there more comments?
And then I will respond to that. Because maybe there are things that are related.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel. My name is Nimah, I'm a teacher at Moscow. My question is to Professor Sharoni. You argued that we should really look at ways to start solidarity through understanding the needs of those most oppressed, and also that we should really focus on the violence enacted on Palestinians without paying attention to the role of Israel or the Israeli state. And I wonder if you could clarify this for me, because how can we think about solidarity and understand the violence without actually contextualizing and historicizing our analysis? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think both of those. That's what happened when we revised both of them. I think there were something was lost in translation in both those cases. But I'll let Rabab answer. In my case, yeah, nothing could be further from what I wanted to get out. Any discussion of Palestine and transnational feminist solidarity has to be contextualized historically and in relation to the structures of oppression. What I meant is in shifting from the dialogue framework of the conflict where there was always this pressure to talk about the experiences of Israeli Jews and what's happening there. And I'm not, I do it elsewhere, but when we talk about the injustice of Palestine, the point I was trying to get across is that it is important to focus on Palestine, to zoom in on that, including the context of the violence of settler-colonialism, the militarization, absolutely, but to avoid the tendency that was there as a prerequisite when you talked about Palestinian suffering to say, well, but not all Jews in Israel agree, and you have to talk about the Israeli peace movement as well to kind of legitimize focusing on Palestinian suffering. This is what I was trying to suggest, that we move past that, or that we continue to work and move past that. And people that look at my writing know that I do that work as well, but I refuse to use that to legitimize the solidarity work that I do in Palestine. And I made it explicit because I think people who are not Jewish still face that expectation that you have to kind of express sympathy with the women's peace movement in Israel to be able to express solidarity, to have express or get engaged, especially when you do BDS work. You kind of have to affirm Israel's right to exist and all the other things, especially when you have a Jewish audience or pro-Israel audience.
Okay, so I'm going to respond and also like maybe pick up on some of the. So I will come back. Why too much? Okay, and it's making me think because why did I say that? Why did I say it's too much? And I'm saying this. I think I'm saying it against a history of exclusion. That you end up thinking that if you are included, you're getting too much. And I think this is really part of inequality. I mean, really, this is part of inequalities. And I was thinking about the way my sister comrades have responded, is that is there too much on Palestine in terms of panels and so on? I had the same reaction to the U.S. Social Forum in 2010, because we were excluded from the one before. It was a very big discussion. It was in Atlanta, I think, in 2007. The U.S. Social Forum. 2008, and then in 2010, people organized, and we had 45 workshops, and some of us were saying, well, let's kind of like try to consolidate and so on. And I think parts of it is that we're always feeling, and I'm now saying as Palestinians, I'm not speaking as the whole movement, I'm speaking as Palestinians, we're always feeling that, are we taking more space from other people, okay? And the reason we're thinking about that is because historically we have struggled with the USP's justice, feminist movement, NWSA, everywhere else to have a space to be able to speak. So when we get a space, we're always conscious about how much space we want to take, because we're also informed by the experiences of other marginalized people, and we don't want to take more space than we could in order for us to kind of like be able to share space, work in coalition, show how issues come together and coalesce and so on. So I guess that this is where, I don't think that people should not have spaces, but I'm also now speaking as a Palestinian who's also working with people in these movements, in the women's movement, in the peace and justice movement, all sorts of movements and so on, is that we want, and I think part of it also has to do with the way we are constructed as from outside, as foreigners, as don't belong. I mean, there is always kind of like, we're coming in, are you coming in and impose your agenda and so on? And I've sat in enough meetings before I became an academic in the US peace movement, in enough meetings where I would go, and I used to go with a bunch of black comrades, and we would say, and we proposed, for instance, Central America. We want to have a speaker on Southern Africa. We want to have a speaker on Palestine. We even used to say Middle East. And we would be shut down. And I remember there was a big demonstration around El Salvador in 1983 in Washington, D.C., and we were shut down. And the next week, we had a whole bunch of other black comrades come in, and we basically were able to get a speaker on Southern Africa, but nobody on Palestine or on the Middle East. And it was just the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. No, it was 1982. Had just ended. Of Beirut, and Sabra and Shatila massacre had just ended, and we could not have a single speaker. And we had all these Palestinian leaders from the Arab world marching. We all marched. We had carried a big Lebanese flag and a big Palestinian flag, and we could not have anybody from the platform. And this is why this whole question of what Simona is talking about in mainstreaming and making like clearly that we're not talking about mainstreaming in the sense of becoming actually another hegemonic formation. If you don't have people from the leadership who actually make it visibilized, because yes, people have been struggling for a very long time in NWSA. And Catherine Haddad came to me in 2013 after our plenary and said, you know, Evelyn Shaker and I have been coming. We tried to get NWSA to issue a statement in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and NWSA refused. And we all, every single one of us can tell you many stories about how in feminist and women's studies spaces and other spaces, but we're talking here, that Palestine has been excluded, and people used to say PEP, progressive except on Palestine. So because Israel was considered to be the progressive cause, Israel was considered to be the country that is modernizing, it's not, besides the Zionist story about being the safe haven and so on, and this is the only solution to anti-Semitism. This is the only way, is to actually create a Jewish state, which we know historically was not the case. But even on top of that, it was always presented as the modernized, as the women's liberator, as the space where things are much more better than the backward, barbarian Arabs and Muslims and so on. So Israel was a progressive cause, okay? And so it was, we could not really get into the door. And sometimes even the meetings, and I can tell you tons of stories, the meetings will be changed, the times will be changed, the dates will be changed. We will be going somewhere, and then all of a sudden they say the meeting has not been. Even yesterday, our room for the Institute for Teaching Gender and Sexual Justice in Arab and Muslim Communities was changed at the last minute. And one of the people who was supposed to be on the faculty did not know. If I didn't check my email, she would not have been there. So, and I'm not sure, I don't know if this was in the same, it was about invisibilizing Palestine. I think it was just a mistake, just a regular technical issue, really technical issue. But we cannot but think about all of these things. Where are they? How do they fit in the larger thing? So I think this is part of why I'm kind of like thinking, is it too much? And if we're going to have more space, I take the critique actually, and I'm going to rethink about how much is too much. And the last thing I would say is actually in our negotiations with the NWSA leadership for various things and so on, and we were pushing for multiple things, the 50th anniversary of '68, the question of academic freedom, multiple things that are going on. We kept being reminded that, well, there are other issues, and we said, of course, all the issues are really important. It's just a question of kind of like, why is it when you deal with a question of marginalized communities, all marginalized communities, all of a sudden the space becomes very limited, and then we all have to split up the crumbs. I mean, so I'm taking that in mind. I'm also taking into consideration the fact that we really want to make sure that we are sharing this space. That because, and that's the last point I will make, is that justice in Palestine is part of the indivisibility of justice. That because we believe Palestine is a just issue, does not mean that it actually takes over other issues. So it's really important to make sure that we share this space. But thank you, I really appreciate it.
Sophie, I want to make sure that you get a chance to say something about your book that's out and it's celebrating, and then we'll take to Reese. I was like, because people are looking for resources, and we're talking about struggles in Palestine. So sorry for putting you on the spot, but do you want?
Thank you. That's so kind. Thank you.
Do you have flyers with you, or are there?
No, I didn't bring. But they will be. So the book is Women's Political Activism in Palestine. It's published by Illinois Press, and there's a book signing today at 5 o'clock. If you have time to come around to the UIP booth, that would be great. And I mean, it's based on field work that I did in Palestine from 2007 to 2010. It traces the different forms of women's political activism, starting with looking at dialogue, but then really looking at the everyday forms of political activism, because I think it's very important to acknowledge and look at these everyday forms of activism, informal forms of activism that I have. So, yeah, thank you, Simona. It would be great to see you there.
Well, I wanted to direct this to Elora and Rabab. Yeah, I wanted to direct this to Elora, but also more broadly, Rabab had talked about the NWSA sort of history post-Lebanon, but it was the women of color feminists, even at that time, who did support the condemnation of the invasion of Lebanon and the Caucasus. But you were talking about you're at a Center for Human Rights, and I'm curious which frameworks work and which frameworks receive more resistance. Simona talked about the criminalization. So if we talk about Palestine within a human rights framework, does that receive less resistance? If we talk about Palestine, also the question of not using the conflict and making the conflict central was an interesting. If we talk about it within a feminist, justice paradigm, but could you start, Elora, and then I'd love to hear from other folks about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that in the program that I'm part of, and in other programming around Palestine too, there is more resistance if it is sent, and this connects to the question about how much is too much and how do we even come to that point of view. I think if the focus is on Palestine only, there is more resistance. So in one way, to what I was talking about earlier, using a more transnational framework. So for instance, clearly there's a temporal connection with the South Asian, the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, and of course the United Nations partition plan for Palestine. And if we center pedagogy and curriculum around these two partition plans and its relationship to colonial projects. And in some of the work we have done, we've also connected it to the U.S.-Mexico border occupation and the long history of occupation and colonial project there, and our relationship and complicity to those histories. I think it brings home the whole question of colonization and resistance in a more clear and immediate way than when the framework is focused on Palestine only. There is, because there's that almost defensive response sometimes we get that, where is the Israel perspective then if you're focusing on Palestine, or the whole paradigm of conflict resolution, right? That there has to be two equal sides and there can be mediation without talking about power asymmetries, of course. So sort of making the primary lens about anti-colonial histories and resistance, bringing in these sort of temporal connections to different geopolitical contexts, I think what is useful, more useful.
And maybe Diana too, because Diana, you're working on incarceration as a framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, sometimes things are mutually exclusive, and sometimes you can complement, and it's a question somewhat in terms of how you focus, I think. I mean, when we went on our delegation, I think Rabab was, and people were on the delegation coming from different standpoints in terms of their understanding of Palestine and the history. And Rabab was very insistent on looking at things from a settler-colonial perspective, and that was the lens that we came to. And I think people struggled with that, or some people struggled with that. And so I feel like now, if you start from a settler-colonial perspective, then of course you can add on human rights violations. I mean, there are human rights, many human rights, and if you violations, and if you then using international law in a context that way is useful. Similarly, and I think this is something we are sort of struggling with, you can look at women's imprisonment as an issue of human rights violations, and that is true. And some of the similarities between the conditions of women in prison are obviously human rights violations. On the other hand, if you leave out the overall systemic connection between settler-colonial projects, which is less talked about in general in terms of the U.S., even than in terms of Palestine, it kind of dilutes the issue. So, but I have to say, when we start our conversation, when we're trying to broaden and mainstream the issue of imprisonment of women, probably, I mean, we talk about settler colonialism, but certainly we talk about the violations as a point of entry for many people who otherwise would not even broach the topic. So that's my answer. I don't know if I should jump. I just want to mention one thing that's not directly in response to that, but I think is important in this conversation and throughout the weekend. It is the way in which the struggle played out around the women's marches in this country, and I'm not sure how many people know about that. But the women's marches for a couple of years have been in struggle around inclusiveness around Palestine, and that I think is part of the mainstreaming and the importance of making that struggle. And in each, I don't know how many different cases, but I know in LA, in the Bay Area, in Chicago, the issue of how much, whether Zionists were going to be put forward as speakers at the women's conferences, that was a central struggle in LA. In the Bay Area, we were able to have a speaker who spoke Palestinian about Ahed Tamimi, who was a woman prisoner at the time. Fortunately, she's now released. She's an ex-prisoner, but hopefully forever, but who knows. But that became a very mainstream juncture to actually talk about women's resistance, women's imprisonment, and the need to push that out, because there was that speaker, and then of course there was a backlash. Why did they have a speaker about Palestine, and how negative? I mean, that was like the backlash from the Zionist perspective. So I think it's really very positive and important to reflect on the ways in which the issue is being played out in more mainstream feminist spaces, and how then as academics, as activist academics, we intervene in those spaces.
I was actually going to just speak briefly about what white Jewish feminists can do to be in solidarity with Palestine in terms of looking at the future. So just a few things here. I think the key piece is using our privilege to shift power. That's kind of the bottom line for me. Clearly following the leadership of Palestinian feminists, offering whatever support we can, logistical, physical, emotional, financial when we can, doing our best to imagine ourselves in the shoes of Palestinian women, whether in this country, other countries, especially in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Wherever we are, to bring the issues of Palestinian rights to every conversation. Whether it's in our synagogues, in our classrooms, in our feminist spaces, in our queer spaces, at the NWSA Jewish Caucus. I just did that yesterday on the panel that I was on. I have a remark here from Indigenous feminist leader Winona LaDuke, who said, "We, the U.S., can't talk about Israel because we can't talk about Wounded Knee, because we have Andrew Jackson on our $20 bill, because we are one huge settlement on stolen land. We can't talk about Israel because we are Israel." So to me, that's what the connection of how can we bring, as Jewish feminists, white Jewish feminists, with the privileges we have, how can we consistently bring Palestine up in a relevant way? And that's something actually that Sherry Gorelick, my colleague, we've been trying to do at NWSA. Sherry, I've been doing it since 1996 in presentations, and Sherry before that, and we'll talk some about that at the 11 a.m. oral history panel. And I also just wanted to bring up, as we know, there have been these vicious and deadly anti-Semitic, there was this attack in Pittsburgh in the synagogue, horrific, really important to speak to that and to make the connections between anti-Semitism, anti-Arab racism, and Islamophobia, knowing that the struggle against anti-Semitism is inseparable from the struggles against Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, and racism overall. My rabbi at Kehillah Synagogue in Oakland, Dev Noiley, consistently urges the importance of us having the backs of people of color, Palestinians, Muslims, and immigrants, saying it's this growing web of relationships that we have with each other that will ultimately keep us all safer and build the infrastructure of resistance to hate. Oh, I also have this quote that connects to some of what Simona was saying. This is from Palestinian Muslim feminist Linda Sarsour, who said, "You can't be feminist in the U.S. and stand up for the rights of American women and then say you don't want to stand up for the rights of Palestinian women in Palestine. It's all connected." And I guess the last point, and this is completely connected to the struggles my esteemed colleague Rabab has been through periodically, who just won her most recent lawsuit. She's won 3 lawsuits now or more. This fierce activism, what a model. Anyway, I can't express my respect and appreciation for her consistent fierceness against these horrific forces that have come against her. But how the new Assistant Secretary of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, Kenneth Marcus, wants to define support for Palestinian rights as anti-Semitism because he wants to intimidate universities into censoring their own students. So while real anti-Semitism is on the rise in this country, Marcus is falsely claiming that supporting human rights for Palestinians is anti-Semitic. So as white Jewish feminists, and hopefully everyone else in this room, we need to speak out in our universities to counter this and instead support open campus debates and discussions, because this kind of muzzling not only threatens our First Amendment rights, but undermines the role of universities in promoting the free expression of ideas. As the group Palestine Legal explains, the remedy for speech with which one disagrees is more speech, not enforced silence. The last point is it's obvious, again, as white Jewish feminists, supporting Palestinian feminist scholarship at NWSA in whatever ways we can, and on our campuses to bring Palestinian feminists to speak, to use whatever resources we can to hear their voices and center their voices, I think is part of what Simona was saying as well. So.
I have one more thing that wasn't in my comments in response to Teresa's question, that is really a question of what do we do with this in our classroom, and we gave several frames. A frame that I used that is to really look at, compare gender-based violence to violence against Palestinians, and look at the dehumanization of victims and patterns of victim blaming in representation of what is happening and the structure around it. And I find that it's no longer acceptable in the Me Too era, in the post-Kavanaugh confirmation, to well, it's happening, but it doesn't have mainstream support to empathize with the perpetrator and dehumanize the victim. There would be a backlash against it. When you compare how the media talks about attacks on Gaza, it is always that Palestinians brought it upon themselves. Or the less, what would they say, outrageous interpretation is that they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then they got bombed. And I sometimes, to an uninitiated audience with no context of Palestine, I'll bring a mainstream media representation of violence, and also because in many general education classes we have to connect local to global. So I find that using the kind of basic early feminist work that contextualize gender-based violence to then make connections to other groups. And then again, that is something that I learned in the trenches during in my standing with women in black in the early days of the first Intifada. We would have a poster board that would list how many women were killed by their Israeli Jewish partner that week, and how many Palestinians were killed in the West Bank and Gaza at the hand of the Israeli military, and connected the violence at home with the kind of broader context of violence.
Can I add something? So just also in response to what you were saying about the university, and I know that our sister Piya Chatterjee was scheduled to be on this panel, but she's not at the conference, but really pointing to her and Sunena Myra's co-edited collection, The Imperial University, I think is a really, really wonderful analysis of what you were mentioning, and I had meant to talk about this earlier, but they argue that there's in this sort of state of perpetual war in and by the U.S., there are 3 fronts: the military, the cultural, and the academic, and that universities are certainly not exceptional spaces here, and they have to be held accountable. So sort of challenging this imperial knowledge complex and thinking through that in our own teaching, scholarship, activism is very critical.
Thank you everyone for coming and engaging. And the business meeting is happening right now.